Later on today's episode of On the Other Hand,
Most people, however, think of public media as the big two, PBS and NPR. And what really sets them apart from your commercial entities, your commercial broadcast corporations, are the funding structure. We rely, yes, on government dollars, but the bulk of our funding we rely on from donations.
this is On the Other Hand. A podcast that features community leaders in Arkansas sharing their views and experiences on how to make Arkansas better.
Hello, and welcome to On the Other Hand. I'm your host, Glenn White. I'm here with my co-host, April Chatham Carpenter, as usual. On our podcast, April and I interview community leaders in Arkansas who help work towards solutions across various political and other divides, or who in other ways try to make things better generally for Arkansans. So, April, who do we have today?
Well, today we're especially excited to be speaking with Jonathan Seaborn, who is the general manager for Little Rock Public Radio at UA Little Rock. And as many of our listeners may know, our On the Other Hand podcast is one of several community-based features that KUAR has on their website. That makes us available via the NPR One app and gives us potentially some national exposure. So we really value our association with KUAR. And we're excited to have Jonathan on the broadcast with us today. Jonathan oversees operations of both KUAR, the National Public Radio affiliate, and KLRE, which features classical music. Jonathan has served in this capacity for over 2 years and has lots of other experience that he brings with us from public media in Texas at Texas Tech. Jonathan, I saw Texas Tech beat Oklahoma in softball last night. So that may be a little bit dated by the time we get but I'm pulling for you guys because I'm not a big Texas fan. Austin,
No one
Texas.
is. No one is. Yeah.
Well, while you were at Texas Tech, you won 4 Telly Awards. You won 3 Lone Star Emmy Awards, 3 Best Documentary Awards, and 1 Public Media Award. And you're already making a noticeable impact at your work at KUAR. I've kept up a little bit on the fundraising and things that you all do, and some big gifts that you've gotten in the last few months. And so we look forward to where the future takes us in your hands at the radio station. And so welcome to On the Other Hand, Jonathan.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start by having you tell us a little bit about what you do on a daily basis at KUAR, especially for those who might not be as familiar with public radio and public media.
Yeah, so as the general manager, I oversee all of the day-to-day operations, and then all of our federal and government requirements from a reporting standpoint that we have to deal with. So we receive money from the Corporation from Public Broadcasting each year, which is a federally funded corporate organization or private organization. And because we receive that federal funding, there is a lot of reporting required. And so a lot of my time is spent making sure that our reporting is up to date, that we're meeting all of those requirements from a CPB standpoint. And then as a licensed broadcast entity, we have a lot of FCC reporting requirements that are due. So a lot of my job isn't, fun or sexy. It's a lot of paperwork and reports and pulling data and making sure that we're in compliance. And then outside of that, I work with my leadership team to make sure that we're meeting the editorial standards from a news division, that we're meeting all of the federal guidelines around what we can do as a nonprofit news organization from a fundraising standpoint or a programming standpoint. But yeah, it looks a little different each day, but a lot of it is data analysis, strategic planning for the future, and then making sure that we're up to date on all of those compliance requirements.
So for those of us who aren't as familiar with those compliance requirements, give us a couple of examples of what those might be.
For instance, with underwriting, we have pretty strict guidelines around what we can and can't accept from a corporate sponsorship level. So the new FCC chair had opened a investigation into NPR and PBS around their underwriting practices to make sure that they weren't too commercial in nature. There's some question around the legality of what that complaint was, in the sense that NPR and PBS as national organizations are not licensed broadcasters. It's the individual local stations that are, but that's a separate issue. But getting down to the requirements, like we can't have calls to action. We can't have price listings. It can't be overly promotional in nature. It is more about informing the listener who it is that supports the station, and then we can list a couple of services that they provide. Without getting too into the weeds, the rules are a little stricter for nonprofit support. So if a nonprofit organization wants to underwrite some stuff, we have a little more leeway in what they're allowed to say. But it's really strict around the for-profit support for the station. The other is monthly. I have to upload a list of local issues and programs that we have covered and aired to the FCC public file. I have to upload a list of corporate support, where we're getting dollars from corporate support to that FCC public file. There's just these different data points like that have to go to the public file, which is open and accessible to anyone if you just go to the FCC's website. In addition to making sure that all of our financial information is publicly available on our website. And year round, Dr. Coleman, our financial director, and I are working with our auditors and our independent CPAs to go through our finances to make sure that we're properly spending all of the money that we're receiving, that we're using it for what we say we're using it for. So it's a lot of bookkeeping and like I said, tracking the dollars and making sure that we're within compliance to what, because we do receive a portion of public funding. So we want to make sure we're being good stewards of that. And we are responsible to make sure that we're being good stewards of those public funds.
Mm-hmm. Well, that makes sense. I didn't realize that was so much of what you did on a daily basis. So thank you for that information. Why did you go into public media in the first place?
Yeah, so journalism has been something that I've always been interested in. I originally wanted to be a print journalist. I worked for the school paper when I was in college, and I was set to graduate college around 2008. So right about the time of the housing bubble burst. And my uncle was an editor at the Austin American Statesman at the time. And he said, you don't want to go into print journalism. The economy is shaky right now, but the writing's already on the wall. This is not something that's going to be sustainable. And so I wasn't interested in traditional local TV news necessarily, just the parameters of how that's packaged and delivered. And I was interested in longer form, being able to dive more into the humanity of things versus being trapped in the traditional television broadcast clock. So I actually went into documentary work and freelance work right after college and worked in that space for a while. Primarily focused on music. Lubbock, where I was stationed right after college, has a very rich music history. It's where Buddy Holly's from. The Dixie Chicks are from Lubbock. There's a long history of music there. So I did a lot of music documentary work and performance work in those early days, just because that's what was available. Through that work, I got noticed by the local PBS station that was there, and went on to originally do documentary work for the PBS station in Lubbock, which is part of Texas Tech, where I went to school as well. And that grew into a larger role. So I pretty quickly was over production, from just doing the documentaries to overproduction, and then shortly after that moved into over all of content. So I was the chief content officer at Texas Tech Public Media for a while. So I was in that station's quite a bit larger than we are. It is a dual license, so it's radio, television, and it's in El Paso, Lubbock, and San Angelo. So I was overseeing content for 4 different stations, 4 different formats, program types. The radio station in San Angelo was nothing like the radio station in Lubbock. The TV station in El Paso, the audiences are just very different. And so that was an interesting experience, and that's where I really got to learn about the process of managing within public media. But it's also where I fell in love. I drank the Kool-Aid somewhat. I fell in love with public media and kind of realized that I was a lifer. Like, this is all I want to do. I couldn't imagine working in another industry. It really does serve a valuable purpose within our communities. And yeah, I believe in the mission, and I couldn't imagine doing anything else.
Okay. First, let me comment on all the rules and compliance requirements and things like that. Most people don't know that. I certainly didn't. And it sounds like you guys have a lot to answer for. So there's a great degree of accountability in what you do. So I appreciate hearing that. Now, that's also the kind of thing that probably a lot of listeners kind of glaze over. So let's get into a little more practical stuff and helping people understand what is public radio or public media, and how's that different from what we see elsewhere in the media environment?
On a very base level, public media is just any sort of broadcast entity that is funded through public dollars in some capacity. So it's not just NPR and PBS. There are community licensed stations like KABF here. That is technically a public radio station as well. You have community licensed television stations that aren't PBS stations, or radio stations that are like tribal radio stations that can receive government funding that are technically public media, but they're not a part of the NPR or PBS system. Most people, however, think of public media as the big two, PBS and NPR, PBS on television, NPR on radio. And what really sets them apart from your commercial entities, your commercial broadcast corporations, are the funding structure. We rely, yes, on government dollars, but the bulk of our funding we rely on from donations. Here at Little Rock Public Radio, depending upon the year, it's anywhere on the low end around 50%, on the high end around 60% of our operating budget is from single small dollar donations from our listeners. And then the rest of it is broken up through underwriting, corporate support, grants, and foundation support. And then the smallest bucket is our government support here at Little Rock Public Radio. That can differ at other stations. More rural stations like Marfa, for instance, in Texas, it's close to 50% of their budget is the CPB federal support that they receive. So while that may be around 10% of ours, like I said, the more rural the community, the higher that percentage can get. But that's really what sets us apart, is our funding model. And because we receive public funding, that's why those requirements are so much higher. Like we are needing to be accountable to the taxpayer for the way that we operate and the content that we produce. The other big difference is that we aren't beholden to corporate interest in the way that a commercial station would be. If my primary funding model is commercial dollars, then I'm going to be thinking about what is it that my those commercial partners are interested in. What is it that's going to keep those dollars flowing? Whereas my primary funding institution is the community, is the people. It is in our interest to make sure that our listeners are happy, well-informed, and feel like that we are serving the role that we are supposed to serve, because they are who we are beholden to most. Yes, because 50 to 60% of our budget comes from their donations, but even on the other side, with tax dollars that may end up in our budget, those are from the same people. That is the same community base. Like, we are beholden to make sure that the public, that we are serving the interest of the public.
A lot of people, I mean, you hear a lot of things talked about public radio and NPR and PBS, and I think we'll get more into that later on. But if you give us a sense of why is public radio important in our communities? I mean, in what way might it serve some purpose other than what is served by the more commercial sources of media?
a lot of times public radio stations or public television stations, they're providing something that may not be commercially viable. So for instance, with KLRE, our classical station, throughout most of the country, a classical radio station wouldn't be commercially viable. It enriches the community. There's been study after study that show that access to classical radio stations increases investment in the arts, and there's economic development that happens around it. But the listenership isn't at a rate that would justify the dollars needed from corporate organizations giving commercial dollars to keep it afloat. So there's that, and that is the same is true with like tribal stations and jazz stations and these other stations that serve a role that, like I said, would not be commercially viable on their own. The other is information. We provide access to as close as you can get to unbiased information in our current ecosystem, and that is our charge. Put the information out there to let the listener make the decision for themselves. But we are part of the emergency, everybody has the emergency broadcast alerts, but it is really our duty as a public service to make sure that when there is some sort of public emergency, that we're not just broadcasting the over-the-air signal from the National Weather Service, but then we're following up and we're really letting people know, hey, here's where you can get water, here's where the state, city, local support are that you can, if your home has been damaged or whatever the emergency may have been. We did a bunch of that after the tornado in 23, but I can't think of a better example of why this is important than Blue Ridge Public Radio after the hurricanes in Asheville, North Carolina. So that, the tornado here ripped through the heart of kind of west and central Little Rock in 23, and there were people that were greatly affected. But Nashville, like there were entire counties that were wiped out and had no power, no water, no cell service, no internet. And that's where things get really important, is that when those things go out, your battery powered radio may be the only way that you can receive some of this information. And that staff in Asheville was working 24 hours a day for weeks on end to make sure that people knew where it was safe to go, where they should stay away from, if there was a gas leak or something, where they could get water, shelter. Once again, here's where FEMA is going to be stationed. Here's where the state and local resources are going to be stationed. And then telling the human stories of the impact that the other stations may not have time or interest in telling. But, we covered a local bike store that got destroyed in the tornado and followed up in a year to be like, hey, now here's where they're at. And then, we plan to keep going back to these places to be like, we were impacted by the tornado. Here's where we are now. Those are stories that are important to the community. It is good for the public record, and it is an issue of safety that, once again, outside of just the initial weather alerts, probably isn't commercially viable or interesting to the big commercial stations. And once again, it's because it is our responsibility to get that information out that we're there.
So if I can kind of summarize it a little bit, it sounds like most media, commercially based media, relies upon income, and that means they have to derive their income from listeners being engaged, being interested in what they have to say. So there's a tendency maybe to cover only the most popular kinds of things that appeal to a lot of people. What public radio and public media covers are other things. You may cover that, but you also cover things that may be less financially enticing for commercial media to cover, plus the obligation to the community in difficult times. Is that a kind of a fair summary?
Yeah. Yes, I would say so. Yeah, we're covering things that there is an audience for, but like I said, it's not. We'll touch on like the hot news of the day, but we're not going to spend the entire 24-hour news cycle hyper focused on this one issue because it's driving ratings. I mean, we see this, anytime there's some big national news story and your CNN or Fox or whoever it is, like it's just talking heads arguing in 2-minute intervals for 24 hours about the same topic. And our goal, and a lot of the times the reason that they're arguing is because there's an entertainment lens there. It is meant to be. In fact, that's been argued in court sometimes, when Fox will be sued about something, and they'll argue that Hannity is an entertainer, not an anchor, and there's those things that happen. And there's some truth to that. They are ratings driven. We need to keep the ratings up. How do you do that? You add tension. How do you add tension? There's, like I said, that 90-second, 2-minute talking head argument that drives that. Whereas our responsibility is to get the information out as close to accurate information as possible, and to not try to, we're leading the horse to water, not making them drink, or whatever. There may be a better analogy than that. But our goal is to get the information out and then to focus on the things that is important to our community, but maybe not, like I said, appealing from a commercial standpoint. But yes, you put it much more succinct than I did.
No, I appreciate the expansion on that idea. Thank you.
So one of the things, as you were talking about, even what happened in North Carolina during that time period, and even during the tornado part, reminds me of a question I had about programming related to how you decide what programming you're going to have and when to put the local part in. I know that, when it seems like that there's like a 5-minute section that's a local or news like every hour or something like that. When do you do that? If people were wanting to hear the local parts, when is that programmed typically?
Yeah, so we do a live local newscast during both of the big magazine shows, so Morning Edition and All Things Considered. So Morning Edition is from 5 to 9, and All Things Considered is 3 to 6 every day. And we do 2 newscasts an hour, a top of the hour and a mid. So we go right after the national. National ends about 4 minutes in. So 4 minutes after the hour, you'll hear us, and about 30 at the 33-ish minute mark, you'll hear a local newscast during both of those shows, Monday through Friday. And then we air feature stories a couple of times a week, where we'll do a more in-depth, it may be on, there was a lot of interest this session about the library board, or, the state PBS, speaking of public media, they were in the news a lot this time. So we may do a longer 4 to 7 minute story, kind of exploring what that is, so that we can give those issues more focus. And that will air in those same magazine shows, but we'll pull out a national block. We'll look at the program and say, okay, there's a national story here about, weather balloons or something. Like we'll put what we think has the least local interest that hour, and we'll replace it with that local story. And that happens, like I said, a couple of times a week, more often during legislative session, just because there's more news happening during that time. We also have a weekly news roundup show. So Fridays at 6, you can hear the news wrap, and that's hosted by Daniel Breen, our news director, and then co-hosted by the news directors at the other 2 NPR stations in the state, KUAF and KASU. And they have a half-hour discussion on kind of the top headlines of the week that's broken down. We have plenty of written articles that make it to the website that never make it to air, just for, we're always racing against the broadcast clock, but also, once again, going back to the legislative session, sometimes the water hose is just all the way open, or whatever, the faucet's all the way open, and there's just no way to get it all on air. So we try to miss as little as possible, and put that stuff that we can't get on air on the website. So you can always check there. Those newscasts and the weekly news roundup are our primary news distribution from a broadcast element. That being said, if something happens, if there's something of interest, like the tornado, or, and it doesn't just have to be some sort of state of emergency. It could be during election time. We'll do this when the race is called. But we can cut out the national broadcast and take over and go in live from the station. So like I said, we did that in 23 during the tornado. We go live. We do this in conjunction with national during elections, but we go live a lot more during elections to cover what's happening here. Arkansas often wraps up pretty early, so from our end, we're usually done, by 9 or 10 o'clock that night. But we do have that ability to cut in pretty much any time if the need arises.
Okay. Well, that's helpful to know because I know that I'll catch it, but I haven't thought about listening to that for getting my local news on a regular basis, or certainly going to your website. So that's good to know. One of the common objections, and I know we hear this in the national media right now, we'll get into the funding controversy right now that's happening at the federal level in a little bit, but one of the objections in some quarters is that public radio tends to be liberal and unbalanced in its treatment of news and events. And I was actually looking up the All Sides media bias chart, and it says that the NPR opinion portion, and this doesn't necessarily mean KUAR, but NPR opinion leans left, but it has a note that says All Sides has low or initial confidence in this bias rating because the bias rating refers only to online news coverage, not TV, print, or radio content, which I thought was an interesting comment that they were making. But in terms of, and you could speak about this in terms of your experience at Texas, but also with KUAR, here in Arkansas, what's been your experience in terms of coverage and balance of news in public media?
And I'll say too that, each year, different organizations put out those like trust in media organizations and where they see them falling on the political spectrum. And NPR and PBS always rank towards the top of the most trusted news organizations. They also fall pretty close to center. They're both in those graphs. They usually fall slightly left of center. And I think that the poll or study that you quoted is interesting too, that it said the opinion section, because NPR doesn't have an editorial or opinion section. It tries very hard to avoid that. I think sometimes what can be confusing to a listener based on where they live is that there's a difference between there are multiple organizations that are producing content that you might hear on air. And what we pull from PRX, the Public Radio Exchange, or American Public Media, or one of these other third-party distributors is technically not NPR content. This American Life, for instance, is an independently produced program that, yes, airs on NPR, and the vast majority of stations air it. But it is an independently produced program released through PRX at a local station, or recorded at a local station in Chicago. That is true for a number of shows that, Think, Fresh Air. All of these things are technically not NPR. The national editorial team at NPR has no input on what Terry Gross is asking whichever author or whatever guest they have on that week on Fresh Air. So sometimes that can be confusing because of the model. Like, well, I heard this and Terry Gross, it sounded to me like this interview was a little more biased than I wanted it to be. And it's like, well, the editor at NPR had no input on that. That was an independently produced thing, and you can direct your questions to WBEZ or whichever station was the presenting station, or whichever independent organization did it. All of that to say, I do think that all stations, all independent producers, local, national, everything, we do all strive to be as unbiased as possible. Yes, we are all human. Yes, mistakes can be made. I would hope that whether that's a local station, national, or an independent, that they are willing to admit when those mistakes are made, and to issue corrections and address them. But I think more than most institutions, your public radio institutions do try very hard to be as unbiased as humanly possible. Once again, going back to, because our responsibility is to the taxpayer and our listeners, and we are trying to present them with information. I would challenge people that question the bias to listen for long periods of time. Oftentimes you'll see an article that will quote a sentence or two from one particular story that aired, during All Things Considered or whatever it may be. And yes, that story may have had a point of view that you personally may have disagreed with. But if you listened to the entirety, was it presented in a way that was saying that this point of view is the only point of view? I would say probably not. And if you listen to the next story, were you hearing a story that maybe, on a different subject, but maybe from a different point of view that you do agree with? And once again, we are serving a broad audience. We're the only media organization, and this is a challenge, because we are responsible to our whole community and the taxpayer base as a whole, that is trying to produce content that is appealing to the ecosystem as a whole, whereas everything else is looking at niche markets. Like, MSNBC is obviously looking at a liberal market, Fox is looking at a conservative market, and they are tailoring their stories for that. We try very hard not to do that. And it is interesting locally. I know you asked about a local lens. My staff tries very hard. We have lots of conversations about when it's appropriate to use certain words, like descriptors, like, well, we don't want it to seem like, did the person giving the quote say that they felt that way, or are you inferring that they felt that way? And there's lots of nuanced, nitpicky conversations like that. We are currently, just because I want to do this semi-regularly to keep my staff as prepared as possible, but we're looking at biased language training to go through on, like a semi-annual basis or something like that, so that we can make sure that we're not inadvertently, sometimes we think this is the common nomenclature, but if you listen to it from a different county, it may be like, well, actually that feels charged, and it shouldn't. So we're very aware of that.
Well, that's it for the first part of April England's conversation with Jonathan Seaborn today. We'll continue this conversation in the next episode, so be sure to check out part 2. And remember that On the Other Hand offers dozens of other interviews like this one. You can access these inside your favorite podcast app or on our podcast page at arkansas.braverangels.org.
Thanks for joining us on today's edition of On the Other Hand. This was the first part of our conversation with Jonathan Seaborn. On the Other Hand is sponsored by Braver Angels in Arkansas. Music was composed by Randall Standridge of Jonesboro, Arkansas, and was performed by the University of Northern Colorado Symphonic Band, Dr. Richard Main, conductor.
From your host, April Chatham Carpenter
And Glenn White.
Let's work together to make our relationships and communities better.